On the first week I moved in, a man across the street shouted from his porch, "That thing's lowering the property value." I froze halfway out of my car door, one hand still on the chipped steering wheel. The words cut through the cool morning air like a thrown stone, loud enough for the other neighbors to hear. Someone laughed, quick, sharp, like they couldn't help themselves. I glanced toward the sound. Behind half-drawn blinds, a face slipped back into the shadows, but not before I caught the curl of a smirk. My car, old, sun-faded, coughing like a tired dog, sat in the driveway as if it too had heard the insult. Its rusted hood reflected a dull, wounded glint of the pale sun, and in that moment I saw it through their eyes. Not as a lifeline that had carried me through storms and empty gas tanks, but as a symbol they thought proved I didn't belong here. The street itself seemed to hum with quiet judgment. A woman walking her dog slowed just enough to glance at my car, then at me, her lips pressing into something between pity and disdain. I wanted to tell her that this car had taken me to my mother's hospital bed on the night the doctor said, "Hurry." I wanted to tell her that it had been my office when I was between jobs, my safe place when home didn't feel safe. But my throat locked, and I realized there was no point. They didn't want a story. They wanted a spectacle. I forced a slow breath and took the grocery bags from the back seat, the plastic handles biting into my fingers. As I walked to my door, I could feel eyes following me from behind curtains and windows. The laughter had stopped, but its echo stayed, not just in my ears, but in the way my chest tightened. I knew this wasn't just about a car. It was about territory. They had decided, before I'd even settled in, that I was an outsider in a place they thought they owned. And standing there on my own driveway, I already felt the first ripple of something darker. A quiet promise in the back of my mind that one day I'd give them a reason to look again. Not at the car, not at the dents or the paint, but at the name on the papers they didn't know existed. And when that day came, the smirks would vanish. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow our channel. All right, let's continue. One morning, as the pale winter sun bled weakly over the rooftops, I stepped outside to find frost feathering the edges of my windshield. But it wasn't the frost that made me stop. It was the folded scrap of paper tucked neatly under the wiper, the handwriting sharp and deliberate as if every letter was etched with a sneer. "Please park further down the street. This is a nice neighborhood." I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because part of me didn't want to. My fingers tightened around the note until it crumpled in my palm. The air was cold enough to bite, but the heat in my chest drowned it out, a slow burn rising from my stomach to my throat. I looked around. Curtains shifted. A shadow flitted away from a window across the street. No one stood outside, but I could feel the presence of eyes, silent, satisfied, watching me read their message. It wasn't about parking. It never had been. That driveway was mine to use, and they knew it. This was about erasing me piece by piece, pushing me toward the curb until I disappeared entirely. My old car had become a marker in their game, a reminder to everyone who passed by that someone like me didn't quite fit their image of nice. I stood there for a long moment, the crisp morning air thick with unspoken judgment. The car's faded paint seemed almost to absorb their contempt, the frost melting unevenly across its hood, as if it, too, was embarrassed to be seen. I thought of every mile this machine had carried me, through empty bank accounts, through rainstorms when I couldn't afford a taxi, through nights when home felt like a locked door. This car had been my companion in survival, but here it was nothing but an eyesore to people who measured worth in glossy paint and chrome badges. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel. For a moment I considered moving it just to avoid the war I could feel brewing, but something deep inside refused. The note was still in my hand, the edges cutting into my skin. Slowly, deliberately, I flattened it out and placed it in the glove box, not to keep as a threat, but as a promise. One day, this piece of paper would be proof that they had tried to push me off ground they didn't even own, proof that they had picked the wrong person to underestimate. The engine coughed to life, its familiar rattle cutting through the still morning. I didn't drive away. I stayed right there, in my driveway, letting the sound echo between the houses. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to face the truth first. Truth written not on a scrap of paper, but in ink they'd never seen, on a deed they didn't know had my name. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the street had developed a rhythm, one I could hear every time I stepped outside. On weekends, small knots of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, coffee cups in hand, leaning just enough toward each other to keep their words from carrying too far. But the moment my steps crunched over the gravel, the air would change. Conversations thinned to murmurs, heads dipped closer, and without fail at least one pair of eyes would flick toward my driveway, toward the same spot my car always sat, as if it were a blemish on their view. The laughter was the worst. It never burst out loud, never called my name, but it lived in that barely contained ripple, half hidden behind gloved hands or the polite lift of a coffee mug. Sometimes I'd catch the faint curl of a smile just as I passed, and I knew it wasn't kindness. It was the kind of smile people wear when they believe they've found something safe to mock, certain their cruelty will never echo back to them. My car had become their evening entertainment, their proof that even in this carefully trimmed, picture-perfect street, someone could still get it wrong. It didn't matter that my lawn was tidy, my shutters freshly painted, or that I paid every bill before it was due. In their eyes, all of that was undone by the machine in my driveway. A little too old, a little too loud, a little too much of a reminder that not everyone here had arrived the same way they had. I began to walk differently, not faster, but straighter, my eyes fixed ahead, as though I couldn't feel their gaze trying to pull me sideways. The cold air would scrape against my lungs, each breath heavy with the weight of things I wanted to say, but didn't. I thought of telling them that my car had more stories than any of their leased SUVs, that its worn seats had held my son when he was small, had carried groceries when my hands could barely afford them, had been my shelter on nights I couldn't find another. But I didn't. They wouldn't have listened. They were too busy polishing their reflections to see past the metal in my driveway. And yet, somewhere beneath the sting of their quiet judgment, another feeling was growing, slow, steady, patient. It was the knowledge that one day the focus of their whispers would shift. They wouldn't be laughing at the car anymore. They'd be staring at something that they couldn't dismiss with a smirk, something with weight, something with my name on it. By early spring, the couple across the street had turned their porch into a stage. Every Friday evening, lights would flicker on before sunset, casting a warm glow over tables draped in linen, glasses that caught the last threads of daylight, and the steady hum of conversation. Guests would arrive in pressed clothes, carrying bottles of wine with ribbons around the necks, their voices bright and easy. From my side of the street I could hear the music, soft, curated, the kind meant to impress without seeming like it's trying. At first, I thought it was harmless, just neighbors enjoying each other's company. But then I noticed the pattern. Without fail, sometime between the first drink and dessert, their attention would wander. It wasn't subtle. A chair would pivot slightly, a head would turn under the guise of looking at the flowers by the curb, and then, inevitably, eyes would settle on my driveway. On my car. On me, if I happened to be outside watering the plants or bringing in the trash bin. And then came the smiles. Not the kind that welcome you in, but the kind people give when they've already decided what you are and are letting you know they haven't forgotten it. Thin, polite, pitying smiles, designed to look harmless but steeped in quiet condescension. Smiles that said, "We've placed you in your box, and nothing you do will change it." Sometimes a guest would point, never directly, always with a tilt of the glass or a casual nod in my direction. Heads would lean together, and the laughter that followed was muffled, but not enough to hide its edge. My car had become a prop in their social theater, a shared joke to keep the wine flowing and the conversation light. I tried once to ignore it entirely. I sat on my own porch one evening, book in hand, determined to enjoy the last streaks of daylight. But their glances were like gnats, tiny, constant, impossible to completely block out. Every time my eyes lifted from the page, there they were. People I'd never spoken to, building a story about me from the safe distance of their porch steps. The worst part wasn't their judgment. It was the certainty behind it. They didn't know my name, my work, or the years it had taken just to stand on this street, let alone own a piece of it. They didn't know the miles my car had traveled, the nights it had kept me warm when walls couldn't. They only knew what they could see, and they'd decided that was all they needed. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the air smells faintly of cut grass, and the whole street seems to hum with ordinary life. I had been out running errands, the kind of small, necessary tasks that keep a week stitched together. Groceries in the back seat, a bag of fresh bread beside me, I turned onto our street with the ease of someone coming home. And then, before the tires had even rolled fully into the driveway, I heard it. "Hey, the junkyard called. They want their car back." The voice was young, high with that sharp, careless energy teenagers carry, the kind that doesn't know or doesn't care how deep it can cut. Laughter followed, sudden and loud, a burst that seemed to swell as others joined in. It came from somewhere near the couple's porch, from a small gathering of neighbors clustered like they always were, drinks in hand, shadows stretching behind them in the late sun. I thought about stepping out, about standing there on the driveway with their words still hanging in the air, and asking them, calmly, directly, what exactly they thought they knew about me. But the image dissolved as quickly as it formed. They didn't want an answer. This wasn't a question. It was a verdict, and they believed it was final. My eyes flicked toward them just long enough to catch the smirk on the teenager's face, the way an older man beside him shook his head with mock pity. Someone whispered something, and the group rippled with another wave of amusement. None of them looked away, as if my reaction, my humiliation, was the entertainment they'd been waiting for. And somewhere in the tight, burning quiet that followed, a different kind of thought began to form. Not a plea for their respect, not even a desire to prove them wrong. Something colder, something patient. I didn't need to fire back or match their cruelty. I only needed to wait for the right moment, the one where their certainty would crumble, when they'd see, with no room for denial, exactly who had been here all along. When that day came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't even need to speak. The truth would be louder than their laughter could ever be. They saw rust. I saw years. Every dent on that hood had a date stamped in my memory. The long scrape along the passenger door. February, the year the ice storm hit, and I slid sideways into a guardrail while trying to get to the hospital before visiting hours ended. The chipped paint on the roof. June, the summer I drove 3 states over to bring my son home after his life had fallen apart and no one else would make the trip. Even the smell inside, that faint mix of old upholstery and road dust, was a comfort to me. It was the smell of persistence. That junk, as they called it, had been my shield in more storms than I could count. It had carried me through nights when rain lashed the windshield so hard I could barely see. Yet I kept going because stopping wasn't an option. It had taken me to job interviews I couldn't afford to lose, idling patiently in the parking lot while I tried to gather enough courage to walk through the door. It had brought home groceries during weeks when I had to choose between paying the electric bill and filling the fridge. They couldn't have known about the winter night when I slept in the driver's seat because my apartment had no heat and the car's old engine could still give me warmth. Or the time I sat parked outside a hospital for 3 days, too tired to drive back and forth, surviving on vending machine coffee, and the knowledge that the person I loved was still breathing on the other side of those walls. This car wasn't just metal and wheels. It was a timeline, a witness to every quiet battle I'd fought and won, even when the victories were invisible to anyone else. It had been with me when I had nothing, and I had promised myself I would keep it until I decided otherwise, not because it was valuable in their eyes, but because it was irreplaceable in mine. So when they looked at it and saw something to sneer at, I almost pitied them. They had no idea what it meant to carry history in something that didn't shine anymore. They didn't understand that real worth has nothing to do with what turns heads in a driveway and everything to do with what carries you through the worst days without leaving you stranded. One day, I thought, they would learn, not because I would tell them, but because the truth has a way of showing itself when it's ready. And when that moment came, they would see the car differently, not as something broken or beneath them, but as a silent witness to the fact that I had been standing here, surviving here, long before they ever decided to measure me by what I drove. Silence became my weapon, not the bitter, seething kind that festers in the dark, but the deliberate kind, the kind you choose when you know the ground beneath your feet is already shifting in your favor. I stopped reacting to their glances, their half-hidden grins, their choreographed porch conversations. I let them have their performances, their shared jokes over wine and weekends. Every raised eyebrow, every smug look toward my driveway, I met with the same calm stillness, because I knew something they didn't. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to explain the history of my car, or the meaning behind every dent, or the years it had stood beside me when nothing else did. Their ignorance wasn't mine to fix. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that the very space they thought was theirs to judge was built on paper that carried my name. The land under my driveway, the soil beneath their sidelong glances, belonged to me in a way their approval never could. So I waited, quietly, patiently. I learned their rhythms, the nights they gathered, the way conversations drifted toward me without ever including me, the smug satisfaction in their voices when they thought I couldn't hear. I let them think I was small, that I was the kind of person whose worth could be reduced to the paint job on an old hood. Every time they overlooked me, I felt the advantage tip further in my direction, and in that waiting, I found a strange peace. The truth doesn't arrive with a knock or an invitation. It arrives like a change in the wind, subtle at first, and then undeniable. I knew that one day, something would break the neat little picture they'd drawn of me in their minds. It wouldn't be me raising my voice or throwing their words back at them. It would be something they couldn't unsee, a fact too solid to be bent by their opinions. Until then, I let them think they had the upper hand. I smiled when I saw them whisper. I took my time carrying groceries from the car to the house, knowing their eyes followed me. I didn't rush to correct their assumptions, because I understood something they didn't. When the truth finally walks in, it doesn't need to ask permission. It just takes its place. The day it came was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes the smallest sounds feel sharper. I almost missed the envelope in the stack of bills and grocery flyers, just a plain cream-colored rectangle with my name in block letters across the front. But the moment I felt its weight in my hands, something shifted. It wasn't heavy, not in the physical sense, but it carried a kind of gravity that made me set everything else aside. I slid my thumb under the seal slowly, almost reverently, as if tearing it too quickly might diminish what was inside. The paper was thick, the ink crisp, and there it was, my name. Not typed in some passing mention on a letter, not scribbled on a form that would be filed away, but bold, official, permanent. It stretched across the top of the property deed like a quiet banner. The house, the land, the driveway, they weren't just where I lived. They were mine. Legally, irrevocably, entirely mine. I stood there in the kitchen, sunlight falling in a long stripe across the counter, and let my eyes trace the boundaries described in precise, almost poetic measurements. Feet and inches, lot numbers, parcel lines, all of it spelling out the ground that I had fought to stand on. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the answer to every whispered conversation, every pitying smile, every insult that had ever been lobbed at me from across the street. I thought about walking straight outside, crossing the street, and laying the deed down in front of them like a winning hand in a card game. But that wasn't the right moment. No, this was something to be used with precision, the way you place a final stone in a wall you've been building in silence. I tucked the envelope back into its cover, slid it into the drawer beside my chair, and rested my palm over it for a moment as if sealing an unspoken vow. The day would come when this paper wouldn't just be proof. It would be the ending to their story about me, and the beginning of the real one. And when that moment arrived, I wouldn't have to raise my voice. I'd just have to open the drawer. That weekend, the ritual began the same way it always did. Porch lights switched on just before the sun dipped, music drifting low and careful through the air, the clink of glasses against glass. Cars lined the curb in neat, expensive rows, their polished surfaces catching the last of the daylight like they belonged in a magazine spread. From my porch, I could see the couple across the street greeting their guests with the same practiced warmth, ushering them toward the glow of their home. I didn't sit down this time. I stood, the cool wooden boards under my feet, the envelope heavy in my hand. The deed was inside, folded once along the crease where I'd run my finger days before. I could feel its presence the way you can feel a heartbeat, not in sound, but in a steady, undeniable pulse. It wasn't time to speak, not yet, but I wanted it with me, wanted the weight of it to steady my spine. Their eyes found me eventually, as they always did. At first, it was the casual, sweeping glance over the street, checking for traffic, for movement, before narrowing in on me. Then came the look I knew too well, that flicker of recognition followed by the subtle tightening at the corners of their mouths, the quiet exchange of amusement they didn't bother to hide. To them, I was still the same occupant of the same driveway, standing beside the same old car they'd turned into a running joke. I let them look. I didn't turn away. My gaze was steady, not confrontational, but rooted, like I could stand there all night without blinking. I knew they were wondering why I wasn't inside, why I wasn't retreating from the sound of their laughter. And though they couldn't see it from where they stood, the truth was resting in my hand, folded and waiting, its edges pressing into my palm like a reminder. I watched them greet another wave of guests, heard the faint ripple of conversation that followed me across the street like a current. Someone gestured in my direction, quick and subtle, the way you'd point out a landmark you've passed 100 times. The laughter that followed was softer than usual, but it was there, a low hum under the clinking of glass. I could have crossed the street then, closed the distance, and ended the game. But endings are most powerful when they arrive at their own pace, when they unfold in a moment so precise it can't be ignored. So I stayed where I was, the night air brushing against my face, the paperwork resting warm from my grip. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was waiting in plain sight. And as the evening wore on, I could feel something shifting. Not in them, not yet, but in me. For the first time since I'd moved here, their gatherings didn't feel like a wall I was on the wrong side of. They felt like a stage I hadn't stepped onto. Yet. And when I finally did, I knew the scene would change forever. It happened deep into the evening, when the porch across the street was awash in golden light, and the guests had reached that warm, unguarded state where wine loosens both tongues and judgment. I had stepped down from my porch, crossing the street with slow, even steps, not hurried, not hesitant. The deed was tucked under my arm, the paper's edges cool against my side, its presence a quiet anchor. They didn't notice me at first. The couple was busy topping off glasses, a small knot of guests gathered near the steps, trading the kind of easy laughter that comes from knowing you're among your own. And then, one voice, a man I'd seen there before, leaning against the railing with his drink, cut through the hum. "You know," he said, just loud enough for the group to hear, "maybe it's time to park that thing a few streets over. Keep the view clean." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, carrying the same undertone it always had. You don't belong here. That was their language, casual cruelty wrapped in civility, and they spoke it fluently. I stopped at the edge of their driveway, the warm glow of the porch spilling over me. My face was calm, deliberately so, and when their eyes finally landed on me, I held them. I didn't rush. I let the quiet stretch just enough for the edges of their smiles to falter, and then I spoke, my voice steady, each word measured like I was placing it exactly where it needed to land. "Oh," I said, "I'll park it wherever I want." A few of them blinked, the words catching them off guard. I took one step closer, not aggressive, just certain. "Because the driveway comes with the house." My pause was deliberate. I wanted to see it happen, to watch the meaning begin to register, the shift in their expressions as their confidence wavered. And the house. I let the sentence hang in the air, letting them feel the weight of what was coming, is mine. The laughter died instantly, as if someone had closed a door on it. The man on the railing straightened, his glass halfway to his lips, frozen there. The couple across the street exchanged a quick glance, the kind people share when they're recalculating a situation they thought they understood. I didn't hold up the deed. I didn't need to. The truth was in my tone, in the stillness of my posture, in the fact that I had crossed the invisible line they'd drawn and stood there without flinching. The paper under my arm was just the proof, the punctuation mark at the end of a statement they couldn't challenge. For a moment no one said anything. The music still played somewhere inside the house, but out here the air had shifted, the kind of shift you can't undo. And standing there, I knew that whether they liked it or not, they would never look at me, or my driveway, the same way again. The silence came like a curtain dropping mid-performance. One moment the air was threaded with low conversation and the soft chime of glasses. The next, everything fractured into stillness. Laughter froze mid-breath, as if my words had reached into their throats and pulled the sound straight out. Heads turned, some too quickly, betraying the instinct to witness something they didn't want to be caught watching. It was a strange quiet, not peaceful, not empty, but weighted. You could feel it pressing down, making every shuffle of feet and faint clink of ice in a glass suddenly loud, almost intrusive. No one seemed to know where to put their eyes. A few glanced down at their drinks, swirling the liquid as if it held the answer to a question they hadn't asked themselves before. Others looked anywhere but at me, at the porch rail, the flower beds, the uneven line of bricks on the walkway, searching for a place to land that wouldn't feel like submission. The same mouths that had so easily shaped my car into a punchline now struggled to form even the smallest pleasantry. The smirks had vanished, replaced with something tighter, more careful. It wasn't shame, not yet, but it was the first hint of awareness that they'd misjudged the ground they were standing on. Somewhere behind the group, a woman shifted her weight and cleared her throat, the sound brittle in the heavy air. She started to say something, maybe a joke to break the tension, maybe a question, but her voice faltered, and she let it dissolve before it reached the end of the sentence. A man beside her gave a small, awkward laugh, but it didn't spread. It fell flat and disappeared. For the first time since I'd moved to this street, I saw their faces without the veil of easy superiority. Some looked confused, others defensive, but beneath it all was a single unspoken truth. They could no longer place me in the box they'd built, and people hate losing the box more than they hate being wrong. I stood there long enough for the silence to become something they couldn't escape from, something they'd remember when they saw me again. Then I gave a small nod, nothing more, and turned back toward my house, each step unhurried, deliberate, my shadow stretching long across the street. They had taken so much pleasure in watching me leave my driveway in that car, but tonight it wasn't the car they were watching. It was me, walking away with the last word, even though I hadn't said a thing. By Monday, the air on the street felt different, not lighter, not friendlier exactly, but altered in a way you could almost taste. The people who once turned their heads away as I passed, now seemed unable to keep their eyes from me. It wasn't curiosity, not entirely. It was something closer to calculation, as if they were replaying that moment from the weekend in their minds, testing the edges of what they thought they knew about me and finding they didn't fit anymore. The morning walk to the mailbox became a study in glances. The man who used to mutter "morning" without looking up now paused, actually meeting my gaze before speaking. His tone was warmer, though still careful, as if he was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. The woman who had once clutched her coffee and hurried past me on the sidewalk slowed her pace, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. These were not gestures born of friendship. They were concessions, little acknowledgments that the balance had shifted. Even the couple across the street, the ones whose porch had been a stage for so many private performances at my expense, greeted me differently. They didn't linger in their doorway like they used to, pretending to be too caught up in conversation to notice me. Now they waved when I pulled into the driveway, their smiles tight but deliberate, as if the act itself might rewrite the history between us. I could see it in the way their eyes moved, still measuring me, still looking for something to confirm or deny what they'd learned. But the easy certainty was gone. It was respect, though not the kind freely given. This was respect born from exposure, from the sudden realization that the quiet figure they'd been dismissing had been holding the deed to more than just a house. They might not like me. They might not ever invite me onto that porch, but they could no longer look through me. And beneath their guarded politeness, I sensed something else creeping in, hesitation. Before, they had spoken about me freely, confident I'd never be close enough, loud enough, or relevant enough to matter. Now they measured their words, their tones, their expressions. I could almost hear the pause in their minds before they said my name, as if weighing the risk of slipping back into the old familiarity of mockery. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw their sudden change back at them. I met their new warmth with calm acknowledgement, the same steady nods I'd always given. Because the truth was, I didn't need them to like me. All I needed was for them to remember that moment every time they looked toward my driveway. And judging by the way their eyes lingered there now, not on the car, but on the door that led inside, they did. Now, every time I turned onto our street, I felt the weight of the moment before it even arrived. I no longer pulled into the driveway like someone slipping quietly into place. I approached it with purpose, easing the car forward as though each inch mattered, letting the tires roll slowly until they pressed into the familiar grooves in the gravel. That sound, the soft crunch beneath the weight, had always been there, but now it felt different. It wasn't just the sound of arriving home, it was the sound of taking my place. The old car, with its sun-faded paint and small constellation of scratches, didn't suddenly transform into something they'd admire. It didn't need to. It wasn't about how it looked. It was about where it sat. And where it sat was mine. Every inch of that driveway, every grain of gravel, every crack in the concrete belonged to me in a way no opinion, no smirk, no whispered joke could touch. Sometimes I'd catch them looking when I came home, trying to do it subtly but never quite pulling it off. Their eyes would follow the slow roll of the tires, the way I cut the wheel to line up perfectly with the edge, the way I let the engine idle for a beat before shutting it off. It was a small thing, but it spoke louder than anything I could have said out loud. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, and nothing you've said changes that. I would sit for a second after turning the key, letting the stillness settle. The car would make its familiar sigh, the engine cooling in the quiet. And in that pause I felt an almost electric satisfaction, not spite, not revenge, but the deep, steady recognition of having endured. This driveway had been the subject of their laughter, their sideways comments, their judgments dressed as jokes. Now it was the reminder they couldn't avoid, the unspoken proof they saw every time I pulled in and claimed it without hesitation. And so the driveway became more than just a place to park. It became a statement, a quiet one, repeated day after day. Every arrival was a reminder, every departure a promise. I'm here, I belong, and I'm not going anywhere. Weeks later, the noise had faded. The sideways glances had thinned, the laughter had lost its bite, and the porch gatherings no longer carried that low, knowing hum whenever my name crossed their minds. Life on the street seemed to have settled, but inside me, something had shifted permanently. I began to understand that what happened wasn't just about a property line, a deed, or the stubbornness of keeping an old car parked exactly where I wanted it. It went deeper, down to the marrow of what a person can and cannot have taken from them. I realized it wasn't about the car at all. They could have their shiny SUVs and fresh coats of paint. Let them gleam under the streetlights if it made them feel important. They could laugh at the rust on my hood, at the weathered steering wheel polished by years of my hands, at the way the engine coughed before it settled into its rhythm. None of that mattered because the metal, the paint, the dents, they weren't the real possession. The real possession was what they could never touch, the dignity of knowing that what's mine will remain mine, no matter how they try to belittle it. The house was more than walls and windows. The land was more than square footage. This place, this ground, had been fought for in ways they'd never have to understand. It had been earned through years of work they couldn't see, through sacrifices they would never make, through days when I had nothing but still moved forward. My name on that deed wasn't just ink. It was history. It was proof that I had planted myself here, and no amount of mockery could uproot me. There was a quiet power in knowing they had tried to make me small and failed. They had measured me against their own shallow markers, cars, appearances, the illusion of perfection, and found me wanting. But that was their blindness, not mine. I had been here long before they ever decided to notice, and I would be here long after they'd forgotten why they thought I didn't belong. Sometimes I'd look out from my porch at night, when the street was calm and their porch lights were dim. The driveway lay in shadow, my car resting exactly where it always had. And I'd think about all the energy they had wasted on trying to shrink me down to fit their picture. I didn't need to change their opinion. I didn't need to win their approval. I had something better, unchallenged truth. Because in the end, it was never about whether they liked the sight of my car or whether they thought I belonged in this neighborhood. It was about the unshakable fact that I was, and always had been, the one who owned the ground they stood on. And that kind of ownership, rooted in survival, earned in silence, was something no one could ever take away. "If you're hearing this," she began, pausing just enough to make every person in the room still themselves, "I'm gone." The syllables fell with a weight that silenced even the quietest shuffling in the pews. There was no melodrama in her tone, no trembling, just the bare truth, delivered with the calm of someone who had already made peace with it.